Hello, and thank you for joining me for this podcast about human-robot interaction and positive psychology. My goal for the next few minutes is to unwrap and look through a new lens for human-robot interaction, one that uses the vantage point of positive psychology. We'll start by defining positive psychology. Next, we'll come up to speed with current positive psychology findings and methods as we explore 6 main areas of positive psychology. Finally, we'll conclude by analyzing the state of HRI with respect to positive psychology and discuss the future of HRI from a positive psychology perspective. I'll then present 5 potential topics which appear to be significant open research areas. Since we're going to suggest examining HRI through a new lens, I think it's helpful to explain what we view as the current lens. So, human-robot interaction is concerned with creating machines that are able to interact with humans in enjoyable and effective ways. More than anything else, though, we often find ourselves creating machines which are attempting to be social with humans. For this reason, HRI as a field has a tendency to use social and cognitive psychology findings in an effort to make robots more socially competent. In general, what we do is we review the models that psychologists have generated and we work to apply them to a human-robot scenario. So we'd say that our current lens or vantage point can be thought of as one related to traditional social and cognitive psychology. Now let's turn our focus and take a look at positive psychology. What is it and how is it different from traditional psychology? This is a quote from Martin Seligman in his 2009 TED Talk about positive psychology. He states in reference to traditional psychology, "We forgot about improving normal lives." So I think what you're going to find is that this quote pretty much underscores the focus of positive psychology. So positive psychology, put in simple terms, is the study of things that go right in life. It's the pursuit of applying rigorous scientific principles to events which have positive outcomes. It's the study of what makes us happy, what keeps us hopeful, what brightens our day. It's the study of what fulfills a human being. So the term positive psychology was first used in one of Maslow's works in 1954, but it wasn't until Martin Seligman was president of the American Psychological Association in 1998 that it became a reignited interest, and he was a big proponent of that. A motivator of positive psychology is that traditional psychology tends to focus on using a disease model when it comes to psychological behavior. This model's been really great. It's provided us with treatments and cures for even a few disorders. But what it hasn't done is it hasn't adequately detailed the accounts of optimal life experience. So positive psychology seeks to supplement the gap which exists in this space. So one important thing to note about positive psychology is that it's not a pseudoscientific endeavor. It's not happyology or a feel-good blurring of true science. Rather, positive psychology invests in examining positive aspects of human psychology using the scientific method. We'll examine positive psychology through 6 focus areas. This is one way of grouping the most popular and relevant aspects of positive psychology, but it's not a fully comprehensive or standardized grouping. It's simply convenient for explaining the bulk of the field quickly. The 6 areas I'll briefly discuss include cultural sensitivity, which involves considering the role of cultural aspects in psychology; living well, which is concerned with how people develop throughout their lives; pleasure and positive experiences, which explores different ways humans obtain pleasure and positive emotion in life; positive cognitive states and processes, which explores the idea of optimal states of functioning; prosocial behavior, which deals with factors that foster interpersonal relationships between people; and finally, positive intervention, which offers methods for enhancing life state through intervention. I'd like to note as we start that it may be difficult to see the direct link between some of these areas and human-robot interaction. However, it's important that we see a complete picture of positive psychology in order to better understand it as a field. So let's get started, and we'll start with cultural sensitivity. While cultural sensitivity is not a unique concept to positive psychology or even psychology, it tends to play a more significant role in positive psychology than it does in traditional psychology. And I say this because traditional psychology likes to generalize things and likes to transcend culture in its models. What positive psychologists have recognized is that when studying the positive aspects of life, cultural values play an important role. So one of the most salient aspects of cultural sensitivity is probably in the individualistic nature of Westerners compared to the collective nature of Easterners. So for example, Westerners are more likely to value personal freedom and autonomy, while Easterners may be more predisposed towards interdependence within the group. In a similar way, Westerners tend to be more future-oriented, while Easterners are more focused on remembering the past. For positive psychology, these observations meant they had a choice. They could decide to try to generalize everything above culture, and there were certainly attempts to do that. Peterson came up with 24 personal characteristics that were universal across cultures, as far as anybody could tell. But in response to this, some people have illustrated that these characteristics do exist across all cultures, but they're manifested differently depending on culture, and that can make a difference. So as an example, forgiveness in one culture routinely involves a third party as part of the process, whereas in most cultures, only the transgressor and the transgressed person are involved in the forgiveness process. So with these types of occurrences in mind, positive psychologists tend to factor culture into their studies. As we examine the different areas of positive psychology, we'll see that culture does in fact play an important role. Our next area of focus that we're going to look at is living well. So living well is a term used by positive psychologists to describe well-being throughout all phases of life. Living well has a temporal interest in how people live a healthy life over time. So this is as their circumstances change and as their age changes. Those studies have been conducted for pretty much all age groups. The most widely known and well-founded results have come from lifelong studies of particular groups of people. One of the key concepts that presents itself early on in the study of living well is that of resilience, and sometimes it's known as the ability of an individual to bounce back. When a person encounters adversity or risk but is able to continue to meet a requirement or norm, they're said to be demonstrating resilience. So the first study we'll look at is a study of 700 Hawaiians, and it was a study from their birth until about age 40. And what it illustrated was that early life resilience is correlated with extroversion and being more socially engaged. So what they noticed was that in a third of the group in their younger adult life, they were found to be living in favorable conditions, while 2/3 of the group was not found to be living in a favorable life condition. And they noticed the difference was that the third that was living in a favorable condition had these aspects of extroversion and being more socially engaged. Now, when they evaluated the group at age 40, 80% of the group showed a favorable life condition, which indicated that resilience did develop eventually over time, but that people with extroversion as part of their personality had resilience at an earlier phase in life. So in addition to this study, there have been 2 other studies that have been extremely interesting for the study of living well. The first is a study of 180 Catholic nuns over a 60-year period. And so what they did here was they had the nuns early in their life write some emotional writings. And what they noticed later, so 60 years later after they had written these, was that there was a correlation between positive emotions within the writing and living longer with mortality risk. And so they found that the nuns that had more positive emotions in their writing actually lived longer than those who didn't. The second study was a longitudinal study on a group of 268 Harvard students, mostly from the classes of 1942 to 1944. And the study looked at a lot of things, but one of the main things that it did was identify factors that were important to healthy aging. And some of these factors were pretty obvious, like not smoking, not abusing alcohol, having a healthy weight, exercise, education. But there were also some, like coping adaptively and having a stable marriage, that were more oriented towards positive emotions and positive aspects of life. And so this showed that the positive aspects had an important bearing on the life outcome of these people in the study. So overall, the area of living well is a growing area of study, and as more data becomes available, it seems to indicate that the positive aspects of life are high indicators of living well and aging well. So this kind of encourages positive psychologists that there's a big importance to what they're studying, and you'll see the different aspects as we go through them of positive psychology and how they relate to going back to living well and aging well. Moving forward, we'll now examine pleasure and positive experiences. When positive psychologists begin to work in areas of pleasure and positive experience, the first thing they like to do is make a few terms clear. So the first term is affect. And affect is considered to be an immediate physiological response to a stimulus. Then there's emotion, which is considered to be a judgment salient for well-being. And happiness, which is a positive emotional state that's particular to each person. So each person is unique for the state of happiness. And they say that a combination of positive affect and general life satisfaction is what they call subjective well-being. So positive psychologists believe that the play behavior that animals exhibit in general illustrates the purpose of positive emotions. That is, that the positive emotions give a signal that there's a time for play and a time for building and consolidating psychological skills for later use. So positive emotions have been shown not only to increase performance abilities and creativity, but also to undo negative physiological effects of negative emotions. So there was a study, and what they did was they first stressed participants while they were measuring their heart rate. Then they showed them a video clip with either a positive emotional content in it or neutral emotional content. And then they saw how long it took them to return to a normal heart rate. And what they found was it was significantly faster to return to a normal state if you were shown a clip with positive emotion. So in a similar way, another study showed that emotional writing is a way to eliminate negative emotions in the long term. Another study did something interesting where they took two groups of physicians and they were going to do a task where they were diagnosing patients. And one group, they gave candy before they performed the task. Now, they didn't eat the candy, they just gave them the candy before the study. And the other group, they didn't give any candy to. And what they found was that the physicians that received the candy significantly outperformed the other group in terms of the correct diagnosis and the ability to problem solve. Now, the effects of creativity and problem-solving skills increasing from positive emotion aren't the only observed effects that we see. There was another study that manipulated if students found change in a payphone or not. And what they found that was just by finding a small amount of money in a payphone, students were significantly more likely to help a stranger later that they encountered. There's also been a few curious effects that have been observed through positive psychology studies, and they've contributed to some unique theories. The first theory is called peak-end theory, and what it's shown is that human recollection of pleasure events or extreme emotional events is not the average of the entire experience, but rather it's the average of the most extreme part of the experience and the most recent part of the experience. So this leads to a concept which is called duration neglect, and that's where humans overlooked how long a pleasant or unpleasant stimulus lasted when they're later asked to recall an event. So related to recollection, it's also been shown that older adults are more likely to recall positive events first prior to recalling negative events when compared to younger adults. So they put more focus on the positive events. Another interesting phenomenon that was discovered was something called the endowment effect, where they found that participants associated a higher value with objects that were given to them by another human in comparison to a self-selected object. This is somewhat related to the mere exposure effect, in which humans like objects that they're exposed to more frequently in comparison to objects that they're not as familiar with. Now, on the idea of happiness, Seligman has presented the three paths an individual can take towards experiencing happiness in life. And to sum it up briefly, the first path is a path of raw pleasures, and it's kind of defined by Freud's pleasure principles and traditional hedonic concepts of psychology. The second stems from what's living a life of engagement, is what he calls it. And it's a life of positive cognitive states, which we'll discuss in the next area. And then the third is derived from attaining meaning and purpose in life. And it's similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So to sum things up about pleasure and positive experience, we've seen evidence that positive emotions serve a purpose of signaling a time to play. We've seen that positive emotions directly correlate with increases in creativity, with decreases in stress, with increases in helping behavior. And finally, we've looked at three paths to the state of happiness. Now, to close this section, I want to show you this chart, which is composed of results from many studies over time, and it presents concepts and events in life which are positively correlated with happiness and life satisfaction reports. So what you can see here is that the largest effects on happiness are mostly linked directly to positive emotions and positive states, which is great for positive psychology because it really reinforces the fact that there's a lot of importance to the areas that positive psychologists are studying. Next, let's turn our attention to positive cognitive states. So positive states and processes can be sorted into those which are more temporal in nature, like hope, optimism, and self-efficacy, and those which are less temporal, such as mindfulness and flow. So first, let's start by looking at those that are more temporal in nature, and we'll start with hope. So hope is the ever-present belief that good may come from bad. Hope only applies to goals which an individual considers valuable, and the leading theories of hopeful thinking indicate that hopeful individuals use two types of thinking: pathways style and agency style thinking. And pathways thinking is thought to be the capacity to find new routes to desired goals, while agency thinking is more to do with the motivation to use those routes that you found. One thing that's been noticed is that individuals who have had successful hope experiences are more likely to be hopeful in future experiences. Now let's look at optimism. So there are two popular theories toward the concept of optimism. And the first is learned optimism, and it points out that optimists distance themselves from negative events that have occurred in the past, while pessimists remain close to them. And as this pattern repeats itself, the individuals become conditioned more into one style of thinking. So the optimism becomes learned, and the optimist becomes more optimistic, and the pessimist becomes more pessimistic. Now the second theory is a little more direct about optimism, and what the second theory says is that an optimistic outlook on an event depends on whether the person holds favorable expectancies about the event or not. So what this theory says is basically whatever you expect to happen is going to influence whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the outcome of an event. Now, optimism has been shown to be correlated with several important life events, and these events include things like starting college, performing well at work, enduring attacks, coping with cancer, and caring for patients. So now let's look at self-efficacy. When people believe in their own capability to produce desired effects, that's called self-efficacy. And it centers around social cognitive theory, and it's linked pretty highly to psychological and physical health. So low self-efficacy is often linked with depression, avoidance, and anxiety. And increasing self-efficacy is often a common goal of psychotherapy. So now let's move on to the non-temporal oriented cognitive states. And those are mindfulness and flow. So looking at mindfulness, a large part of it involves overcoming the automatic behaviors that we engage in and actively engaging with a situation and with people. So there was a study of elderly individuals in a care facility, And they had two groups of residents, and both groups were given house plants. And one group was told they would be responsible for making decisions on the care of the house plant, while the other group was told that the staff would care for the plant for them. So 18 months later, they came back to do an evaluation, and what they found was that 15 of the 43 residents in the staff care condition, they didn't take care of the houseplant themselves, had died, while only 7 of 44 in the self-care condition had passed away. So the result is thought to be due in part to the alert and mindful nature that being engaged in the plant's care and the care decisions for the plant encouraged. So closely related to mindfulness is the concept of flow, also known as optimal experience. And flow is considered to be a state when perceived challenges outweigh personal skill. And in addition to that, there are clear goals with immediate feedback that's present. So artists, composers, and scientists have all been known to enter states of flow. And it's when other aspects of life besides what you're focused on just seem to fade away. And so what's interesting about flow is that it seems to be more prevalent in Western culture and the way that it's defined. And there may be other conditions in Eastern culture that encourage flow, but as far as the perceived challenges outweighing the goals, that's actually a Western preference, and it's been seen that Easterners don't share that preference. So overall, positive cognitive states and processes are critical to the production of positive emotions and being in a state of well-being. Positive cognitive states are increasingly linked with desirable life outcomes, as are positive cognitive processes. So you can see the importance of positive cognitive states in relation to positive emotions and positive psychology. So our fifth area of focus is prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior is a focus on behavior which promotes and fosters social connections between individuals or interpersonal relationships. Concepts like altruism, empathy, forgiveness are all relevant prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior is different from the previously discussed topics in that it focuses more on the interactions of two social beings rather than the feelings of a single being. So to start with, altruism is a behavior that's aimed at benefiting another person, and it can be motivated by either egotism or empathy. Volunteerism is thought to be a natural example of altruism. Now, empathy-driven altruism may occur without benefit to the person instigating the behavior. So empathy is defined as the ability to match another person's emotions, but it may entail also a sense of tenderheartedness towards the other person. Empathy can be increased by drawing a person's attention to similarities that they share with another person. And it's been shown to be a critical precursor to forgiveness. Forgiveness is defined many different ways by different researchers, but they all kind of agree on a general process for forgiveness. And it's 3 steps. And the first step is realistic appraisal. The second step is a release of the transgressor from rumination and negative affect. And the third step is a lessening of the desire to punish or harm the transgressor. So prosocial behavior proves to be pretty key in interactions between humans, and the concepts of altruism, empathy, and forgiveness are tightly woven into the fabric that makes up interpersonal relationships. So these are factors that are commonly addressed in psychotherapy as a method of mitigating difficult human circumstances and social aspects of life, and they're very important for interpersonal relationships. Finally, let's briefly examine positive intervention. So ultimately, positive psychology is interested in positive intervention methods which can enhance the state of all people within a society. And they segregate intervention methods into 2 types: primary prevention and secondary prevention. So primary prevention contains actions that are taken to lessen or remove the likelihood of subsequent psychological difficulties, while secondary preventions address the problem as it unfolds rather than beforehand. So one significant hurdle to overcome with primary prevention is what's called the illusion of uniqueness. And that's where individuals believe that bad things won't happen to them because they are unique. And so one important part of primary prevention is overcoming this. Secondary prevention programs are typically rooted in more psychotherapy type approaches. So now let's turn our attention to existing work within HRI. Particularly, let's look at work which has explored some of the ground that we've just covered in looking at positive psychology. A total of 11 HRI studies have been conducted, which includes some aspect or psychological concept that's best viewed through positive psychology. There have been 3 studies on aspects of culture in robots. There's 7 studies that have involved prosocial behavior, and 1 that's examined positive cognitive states. 3 studies concerning robots and culture have been conducted. The first one was a 2008 study by Evers and colleagues, and it challenged the assumption that Western values are universally acceptable for robots. So it was a 135 participant study, and it involved 2 nationalities, Chinese and American. And what they found was that Chinese participants were more likely to anthropomorphize the robot and indicated a stronger sense of control over the robot. But overall, Americans had higher trust in the robot. Overall, the study concluded that predictions from human-human interaction don't necessarily carry over universally for human-robot interaction. The second study was a 2010 study by Wong and collaborators, and it investigated decision-changing behavior among different cultural groups. And it did this by varying the communication style as either implicit or explicit. The study had 320 participants, and again, it was Chinese and American nationality. And what they found were that Chinese participants were more likely to alter their decision when the robot communicated in an implicit way, as opposed to Americans who were more likely to alter their decision when the robot communicated in an explicit manner. It was also observed that Chinese participants were overall more negative in their attitudes towards the robot. But the main conclusion of the study was that when the robot follows cultural norms, it leads to a better human-robot interaction experience. Finally, Wise and collaborators are currently conducting studies to evaluate the nature of task-dependent robot personality attributions across cultures. So preliminary trends, which they've seen, have shown distinctions between culture and the trust of the robot and compliance with the robot. However, there currently are no clear differences in personality attribution due to cultural effects. So through these 3 studies, it's pretty evident that human-robot interaction, much like human-human interaction, is in fact culturally dependent. And despite its obvious importance and relevance, there haven't been any strenuous attempts at modeling cultural factors for human-robot interactions. And so as globalization continues to increase, cultural factors for human-robot interaction will become increasingly important. So next, let's move on to prosocial behavior, which focuses on behavior that promotes and fosters social connections between individuals. And it's been investigated somewhat narrowly within HRI. Specifically, 7 studies have been conducted, and they've all examined aspects of empathy within human-robot interaction. So together, these studies have illustrated a few things. First, they've shown that more anthropomorphic robots are more readily empathized with. They've shown that multiple modalities are capable of eliciting empathy. And they've shown that mirroring the participant or a person is a successful strategy for gaining empathy. And finally, they've shown that participants can recognize when a robot is attempting to be empathetic towards them. So through investigating empathy between humans and robots, there's only been really a sparse sample of the full spectrum of prosocial behavior that exists and is possible in social interaction. Additionally, there haven't been any clear computational models or strategies for empathy generation or eliciting empathy in the current literature. So future efforts may want to focus more on exploring other prosocial behavior and formally defining empathetic prosocial behavior. Finally, positive cognitive states have been scarcely examined within human-robot interaction. So only a single formal effort has been made to investigate positive cognitive states. And specifically, that was a 2005 study by Marty that attempted to study flow in human-robot interaction. And what they did was they took 3 different robots, Pero the Seal robot, iBlocks, and Lego Mindstorms. And what the study concluded after looking at different aspects related to flow and related to these robots and the user interaction was that flow could not be designed into a robotic system. And either it was supported or hindered by the system, but the system itself could not induce flow. So what they decided instead was that robotic systems and robotic designers should focus on aspects of awareness, expression, and engagement in order to support flow states. So overall, HRI as a field has not sufficiently addressed or evaluated positive cognitive states as part of interaction between humans and robots. So though this area may be technically challenging and require some strenuous studies, it's undoubtedly a critical area in order to produce optimal and more natural human-robot interactions and experiences. As the positive psychology perspective is not yet common among HRI practitioners, I'm going to now focus on a roadmap of where psychology fits in HRI and how it benefits HRI. Now let's take a look at where positive psychology fits within HRI. So what's interesting is positive psychology is generally a second perspective on traditional psychology, and so that makes its role in HRI pretty well delineated already. So currently, social psychology is probably one of the most valuable aspects to HRI. And like social psychology, positive psychology shares a viewpoint of observing social phenomena, and it's also well suited for HRI. Another thing is that HRI traditionally focuses on positive aspects of user experience. It's rare that HRI wants to produce a negative outcome, a negative user experience. And so positive psychology's focus on things going right is something that offers appealing insights. So considering the full scope of positive psychology, HRI practitioners are faced with 2 challenges. And those challenges are, first, extracting the relevant aspects of positive psychology, and then ordering these relevant aspects by societal demand and technological feasibility. So for example, while secondary positive prevention techniques are critical in adverse psychological circumstances, it's unlikely that robots will be able to successfully deploy these tactics within the near future. Now conversely, techniques for mirroring human emotion in order to generate empathy have already been explored by a number of HRI studies and are of more immediate relevance. So let's take a look at this figure. What this figure does is it tries to show the comparison between societal demand and technological feasibility of each area that we've looked at of positive psychology in relation to HRI. So the figure illustrates a high societal demand for techniques based in the areas of living well, pro-social behavior, and cultural sensitivity. Furthermore, pleasure experiences and intervention are rated as being lower in demand. And areas like positive cognitive states, intervention, are also highly demanding of technology and may not be feasible at a high fidelity level in the immediate future. So it should be noted that this figure is made at a high level estimation of the evolution of positive psychology within HRI. And so inevitably we'll see work and progress in all of these areas, but this is predicting the technological feasibility and the societal demand of each area as it relates to positive psychology and HRI together. So finally, let's talk about the benefits of engaging in interdisciplinary collaboration with positive psychology. And I think they're primarily rooted in the field's quest to discover positive aspects of human life and social behavior. So HRI is rarely interested in an unpleasant user experience, and positive psychology shares a common goal with HRI to improve human experience. So while traditional psychology offers many insights into human social and cognitive behavior, it's not primarily focused on achieving pleasant effects. or examining in much detail the pleasant aspects of life. In fact, much of traditional psychology is dedicated to characterizing behavior and intervening in a clinical sense when necessary. So in comparison, positive psychology is much more focused on achieving pleasant effects in everyday life. And in addition to supplementing traditional psychology, positive psychology also avoids the dangers associated with some pseudoscientific approaches, because there's a central theme of adhering rigorously to the scientific method for explanations of all behavior. So overall, positive psychology is a pretty good fit for HRI practitioners that are looking for a positive user experience. So that concludes our look at positive psychology and human-robot interaction. I hope that through this presentation you've seen that positive psychology is a potential lens for looking at human-robot interaction, and I hope that you'll further explore using positive psychology within human-robot interaction. So now we'll go ahead and continue and look at a few potential topics that could be open areas of research. So I've got 5 topics that cover 5 of the 6 areas that we examined earlier in the presentation. The first topic has a central research question of how should a robot detect, learn about, and participate in specific cultures in a social manner. And I see this as being a pretty even mix of computer science and psychology. I see some novel contributions in the computer science area of culture detection and cultural learning. From the psych side of things, I think that this would involve the identification of differences in culture, obviously, which a lot of them have been identified, and so it would mean transferring that over to a model. And it would mean some multicultural studies. The challenges that I see with this area of research are the identification of cultural aspects, just the technical feasibility of doing that, limiting the dimension of the work so that we only look at certain aspects. How do we figure out which ones are the most important so that this doesn't take forever? And these are somewhat difficult studies to conduct because you want to be very careful and you want to include true multicultural studies. So the next area, the next research question has to do with resilience, and it's how can a long-term robotic companion foster aspects of resilience? And I see this as having more of a psychology backing than a computer science contribution. I think there could be some computer science contribution in learning about and detecting resilience, but overall I see more coming from the psych side in determining what things should be done in order to foster resilience and how a machine can do those. They're not centrally computer science questions, but they are human-robot interaction questions. Some of the challenges that I see here are that obviously there's different ages of people that you're looking at, and so you need to make a choice there. If you're doing children, or are you doing old people, or are you doing young adults, or anything like that. And also this may be looking at some longer term studies, and those are long term, so those take a while, which obviously can be challenging. And I think it would be heavily content based, as far as resilience would probably depend mostly on the content of what is being said by the robot. So the next area has to do with pleasure experiences, and it's a simple question: is what strategies can a social companion robot employ to create positive emotions? And I see this as being a stronger psych-sided question than computer science. Obviously you have some work with affect detection and generation, but there's been a lot of work already done in that area. I see it as a very interesting question and a very critical thing for robots to be able to do, but I think it has low computer science novelty, and that's one of the challenges to it, is finding the novelty from the computer science side. I think some of the strategies might be a little bit too straightforward, but then again, no one has really demonstrated them, so someone should. And I think it may run into the area of persuasiveness, and we've seen a lot of persuasive robots, so I think that there may be some similarities there. The fourth research question would be, how can a social robot create and foster positive cognitive states? And so that's things like flow and mindfulness. And I see this as almost an even contribution. I think that developing a computer science model of positive cognitive state, and developing more than that, developing interfaces which are positive in nature and foster positive cognitive states, is quite a challenge. And I think there's quite a bit on the psych side to look at. Some of the challenges here are that there are a lot of questions that come up with this. This is pretty vague, I guess. So are you looking at long-term or short-term interactions? Are you looking at maybe search and rescue and optimism and hope? Are you looking at maybe interactions in the home or workplace and fostering creativity and things like, helping kids with homework? So this requires some exploratory work to pinpoint specific details, but it is an incredibly interesting area. And the final research question that I see is, which factors contribute most to interpersonal relationships between humans and robots, and how can robots better exploit these factors? And again, I see this as almost an even contribution between psychology and computer science, with models of interpersonal relationships and learning of the interpersonal relationship formation process, and that process over time being interesting computer science problems. I see a lot of interesting psych problems too, of selecting the factors that are going to be important, and I think there might be some interesting studies of people who have bonded with machines, so to speak, already, and what those relationships are like, and if there's a real difference there. Some of the challenges are that this is wide in scope again. It's vague. It needs exploratory work to really pinpoint which factors you would work with. And I don't think the modeling on the computer science side will be easy. I think it leans towards a longer term interaction, but it could also be a short term interaction, a short term relationship forming as well. And so that would require, again, going back to psych literature and defining short-term relationships and long-term relationships and seeing where that cutoff exactly is. So those are 5 of the 5 possible research questions that I see based on this literature review. Obviously, there are many more questions, many more specific pinpointed questions that you could ask using positive psychology concepts. But these are just a few of the more general ones that I see as being very interesting.